Can you hear me? All right. So hello, I'm Sachin Sundar. I'm a senior at Gallatin, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a work this summer I did in Appalachia, specifically in Morgantown, West Virginia, on social and economic rights. I will say this presentation was definitely designed to be more than the allotted time, so I'll get through it as fast as possible, I promise. So went the wrong direction. I want to start off, can we get the next slide? Unfortunately, with somebody who I'm scared to say in a few weeks might be one of the most powerful people in the United States, but his book, Hillbilly Elegy, is actually what has shaped popular perception of Appalachia throughout America. And when this book came out, it was actually lauded by liberal pundits. And I've just kind of pulled this random quote from the New York Times, but Jennifer Senior of the New York Times called it a, quote, discerning sociological analysis of the white underclass. And I have quite the opposite opinion, especially after going to West Virginia this summer. Vance's thesis kind of sees poverty in Appalachia as a result of personal failings and what he calls, quote, hillbilly culture. And he doesn't really look at the structural conditions such as corporate domination and imbalances in economic and political power. So kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to pursue this fellowship was to kind of look beyond the standard, you could say the liberal or the mainstream narrative, and kind of look at the kind of structural economic conditions that lead to poverty and deprivation of rights in Appalachia. So that's why I decided to work with Mountain State Justice, which looks at imbalances in economic and political power and defends low-income West Virginians from who face mistreatment from powerful institutions, such as employers, banks, and private prisons. And I also really like them because they did political advocacy as well as legal advocacy, so they worked with community organizations on the ground. So I've kind of put together kind of like a bullet-pointed list that kind of vaguely talks about the rights that Mountain State Justice protects that are within the ambit of economic and social rights. It is worth saying that the U.S. is one of the few UN member states that has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So we had to do sort of like creative things to defend these rights in an American context. For the sake of time, I won't go into depth for each of them, but for example, consumer rights is not something you typically think as a way of defending human rights, but we were able to mobilize them to defend the right to affordable housing, for example. I also want to give a little bit of historical context about Appalachia. So Appalachia, as most people know, it is where a lot of coal mining took place. And historically, there's this coal town system where employers basically, or these coal operators specifically, had these municipal charters, and the employees lived within these company towns. And you can see some of the pictures here of those towns. And basically, workers were paid in scrip, which is essentially like made-up monopoly money. And it only works at the company store. Workers were forced to live in company housing. Like, you couldn't own your own land or grow your own food. So the company was able to make back a lot of the wages it paid back just by basically having these workers dependent on them. And also the rule over the town, so like the councilman or the mayors were all chosen by the company. So you can see there's like a situation of almost like complete economic dependence and domination. And I won't go into it too much here, but if you read a little bit about the history, the picture on the far right is about the Battle of Blair Mountain, which is the largest armed uprising since the American Civil War. And workers literally took up arms against their employers, and the US military had to be called in. So if you want to have a good time on the internet late at night, I'd recommend looking up the videos about that. So we worked in this one town called Moorfield, which was this small rural town which is called the poultry capital of West Virginia. And basically there's one single dominant employer, Pilgrim's Pride, which is a poultry plant that primarily hires undocumented workers from Central America. And it's considered one of the most dangerous workplaces in the state. And it has one of the most hospitalizations of workers in the state. And a lot of these injuries are often unreported. So kind of because of like attorney-client privilege and the fact that a lot of this work is ongoing, I can't go into like super detail about specific cases, but what we did in many cases is help them towards a path towards legal residency and citizenship, and also towards addressing many of the abuses they face in the workplaces. And what I noticed is that many of the structures within this town were actually very similar to the coal towns in Appalachia. So the company owns the apartment buildings, the daycare, and the recreation center. So the workers live in company housing, and the rent is taken directly out of their paycheck. And they're charged like almost exorbitant amounts of rent, almost double the price of similar housing in nearby towns, because the company kind of controls everything. And this is not something that I just noticed. David Hardy, who's David Workman, excuse me, who's the Hardy County Commissioner, has also said that this town is reminiscent of the old coal company. So I do think the U.S. should ratify the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, but I don't think that it's enough. As the scholar Samuel Moyn has noted, the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights tends to focus on sufficiency, but also doesn't really tend to consider how a radical economic inequality can lead to a deprivation of rights. And I do think to some extent the human rights framework is kind of captive to this Cold War dispensation that creates this false dichotomy between civil and political rights and social and economic rights. So I'm going to kind of like build on what Rhea was saying, could we get the next slide? And kind of pulling from the American socialist tradition, which is kind of an odd place to look at human rights. But actually the American socialists of the early 20th century conceptualized human rights as workplace democracy, as political and economic democracy, and really building power from the ground up. I'm wearing a pin of student workers at NYU, which is one of the unions here. And I really genuinely think that beyond ratifying the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, the best way to protect these rights, both at NYU and West Virginia and elsewhere, is building workplace democracy from the ground up and working with community organizers. And that could really help in actualizing these rights within the United States. So yeah, I'll leave it there. And thank you.